Okay, so now we're going to be looking at Book Two and the virtues themselves. So these are particular excellences of character that Aristotle thinks we will have well-being if we gain. And we imitate people who have these. We see the beauty of their lives and we imitate them. For Aristotle, the person who best encapsulates the virtues is Hector from the Iliad. So if you've seen Troy, that's Eric Bana's character. He's the great gentleman, warrior, scholar. He's got it all. He's a loving husband. He's a wonderful strategist. He's a good brother. He's wise and he's brave. He goes out to fight Achilles even though he knows he's going to die. So we admire his character and we try to imitate him. For Aristotle, imitation is very important because when we're not virtuous ourselves, which none of us are when we're young, we wouldn't even know how to get started. So the idea, Kant's idea, later modern notion of autonomy, individual autonomy, is somewhat foreign to Aristotle. In what sense could I autonomously choose the right path? I wouldn't have any idea what I was doing because I have a terrible character. Once I gain a good character by imitating the beautiful person, or the person whose life is beautiful, then I can look back on what I did and realize why it was good. But ultimately, I wouldn't even know how to begin becoming good. So that's important for distinguishing between ethical theories which focus on what you know and ethical theories which focus on how you live. So looking at the virtues themselves, he always starts with courage. And the important doctrine here for Aristotle is the doctrine of the golden mean. And that's the notion that there's a virtue, that for every virtue, there is a vice on either side. So we tend to think of virtues as having like an opposite vice. But Aristotle is saying actually there's a virtue in the middle, which is just the right amount of a certain emotion or action. And then you can fall off the horse on one side or you can fall off the horse on the other side. So for instance, with courage, that's with regard to fear, the emotion of fear. So I can have the emotion of fear in the correct amount, which is courage. So courage is not having no fear. It's having the correct amount of fear or having fear at the right times or with regard to the right things or the right person. And that's why we call some things phobias, because we consider it absurd to be afraid of them. So for instance, I have a friend who can't ride in elevators because she's afraid of being in a small metal box, no matter how many times you tell her that it's very safe. Comparatively to many other dangerous activities that she does, she can't help it. She just doesn't want to be there. So on the one hand, you have cowardice. Cowardice is going to be the vice of having too much fear or fear in the wrong situations. But you do have another extreme on the other side, and that's having too little fear, which he calls recklessness. And so you see now recklessness might be less common, but we do know about it. You know, we think of shows like Jackass. I don't even know if that show's on anymore, but shows where you know, people are doing terribly risky things for really no good reason. And so we think, you know, they should be more afraid. Or you might think of teenagers having a kind of it'll never happen to me attitude towards life. They need to have some fear, some healthy fear of the consequences of their actions, because those consequences are real and we ought to fear them. So there's appropriate fear. So another thing to mention here before we get going with our list of virtues is that Aristotle thinks that every emotion has a purpose. It's there for a reason. There's no emotion that you need to just get rid of. So that's going to be his big disagreement with people like the Stoics or the Buddhists, where you want to simply retreat from desire and retreat from emotion and become totally undisturbed by outside circumstances. On the one hand, yes, he wants you to have an enduring sense of well-being no matter what. On the other hand, no. Anger is an appropriate response to injustice. Fear is an appropriate response to danger, etc. These are all given to us for a reason, and they're not to be escaped. Emotion is not for escaping from, it's for telling us something that we need to know about how we ought to act. Our problem is that we get our emotions out of balance. So his idea is not to get away from emotion, but to have the right emotions at the right time towards the right people for the correct duration of time and with the right intensity. Okay, so it's hard sometimes to fall right in the middle of the saddle. What other virtues can we discuss? Gentleness. Gentleness is the virtue with regard to anger. So I think by gentleness, he says, you know, we don't really have a word exactly for this virtue, but it's the slow to anger idea. this person is capable of getting angry when it's appropriate, but we think of them as fairly gentle because they don't lose their temper. So it's a kind of balance. Of course, you have the rageaholic, the person who has a real temper. But on the other hand, you have the person who doesn't get angry enough. And he thinks this is extremely unlikely or extremely uncommon. But if it was then, it's not now. So it might be uncommon in an honor society like the Greeks have. But I think nowadays it's very common to meet people who are treated badly and do not care and don't stand up for themselves and don't feel angry. People who give and give and give, they give way too much and allow themselves to be taken advantage of. People who apologize constantly, even though they didn't do anything wrong. He says it's so rare he doesn't even have a word for it, but he calls it insensitivity. No, that's his word for pleasure. I can't remember what he even calls it, but I always use the term doormat. It's a person who's a doormat. And I ask my classes often whether they think it's more likely male or female, because I always think it's kind of a female thing. We're happy to take whatever you give us, and we don't want to appear to be too forward. But actually, the classes often argue that there are many, many men who are in the same boat, allowing themselves to be taken advantage of, and it just doesn't make them angry for some reason. So that would be a vice as well, because what you have then are people who continue to perpetrate injustices and no one stands up to stop them. So anger is an appropriate response to injustice or to one's sense of dignity. Now, you may not want to stay there very long before you get past it, and we can get into what the Christians are going to have to say about things like anger later. Nevertheless, as an initial response to something, it seems appropriate. If you burn down my house and I don't have any sort of anger about it, then there's something wrong with me. You wouldn't consider me to be functioning correctly. What else? We also have generosity or liberality. So this is our attitude towards money. What's our feeling about money or our willingness? On the one hand, obviously, we talk about people who are misers. They're not generous. They're greedy. And we usually think of that as being the opposite of generosity. But of course, you can also be wasteful or prodigal, right? If you remember the story of the prodigal son in the New Testament, that's the story of a man who got his father's inheritance early and then just completely wasted it on partying and women and fair weather friends. And pretty soon it was all gone and he was starving. Nobody wanted to hang out with him anymore because his money was out and he had to eat with the pigs. And so obviously wastefulness is a problem too, and you can certainly see people give too much, sometimes in ways that don't help other people and are actually harmful to those people. Now what's interesting with generosity is that you have actually two virtues. You have the virtue for regular Joe Schmoes like us, with our normal amounts of money, or you have a different virtue called magnificence, to go for people who have lots of money. And you might say, well, why is there a different virtue, for people who have more money? But if you think about it, it's really a different skill set, right? So we were talking about using our capacities excellently. For me to be a generous person, I don't have to know how to throw charity balls or how to, glean through different charitable organizations to make sure they're being efficient, or some of the things that Bill Gates has to know how to do, right? He's operating on such a different level. I'm thinking of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. We would use the term philanthropy, which is the love of man, philanthropy, probably for this. However, for Aristotle, I want to be very clear here, the word would not be philanthropy, because when he's talking about magnificence, he's talking about throwing parties and giving things to your city, which are honorable. Generosity is appropriate towards one's friends. It simply does not occur to anyone before Christianity that you would be concerned about being generous to people you don't know. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. To the Greeks anyway. The Greeks don't have anything like that. They have hospitals for, soldiers and things like that. The city feels that they owe something to the soldiers, but they certainly wouldn't have a hospital for the poor. It just wouldn't occur to them. So magnificence means something like throwing really great parties or funding a library for the city or something like that. And Aristotle himself did leave in his will to money for 2 sculptures to the gods to be erected in Athens in his name. So there's 2 virtues that have to do with money, depending on how much money you have. Similarly, there are 2 virtues having to do with the love of honor. So you and I have a certain love of honor, which is that we just want to have a good reputation among the people that we know. That's very good. You ought to want to have a good reputation among the people that you know, assuming that they're not crazy sorts of people. And you can have too much love of honor, where you're trying to get a status you don't really deserve, or you're trying to draw attention to yourself constantly. But you can also have too little love of honor, where you just don't have any ambition, and you're happy to live in your mom's basement for the rest of your life, and you don't really care what anybody thinks. And that would be considered, I mean, he calls it unambitious, right? But you're just sort of a layabout. Similarly to generosity, you have the higher level, magnanimity, greatness of soul, which is the desire for honor, or maybe perhaps more to the point, to be worthy of honor. And in this case, it's of great honors. And so people who are wealthy or famous or highly talented in art or music or something like that would be more at the level of magnanimity, wanting to do well at a very high level. And once again, it's a different skill set. You and I might be able to go out and get away with certain things that a rich and famous person can't, because everyone's taking pictures of them constantly, and it might be misinterpreted, and they have to take all of that into account, et cetera, et cetera. So you really do have a different standard that you're being held to. If you're in the public eye, you can kind of see how there's different things that have to be taken into account, and it would probably be quite a bit more difficult. Now some are mentioned, which, well, I should mention temperance, of course, which is a very basic virtue. In some ways, it's considered the queen of the virtues because it's necessary for all the others. And temperance is just self-control. We're familiar with temperance from Plato. So you've got self-control. You can say no to yourself. The intemperate person can't say no to themselves. They give themselves whatever they want. Aristotle does mention the possibility, and this is where he uses the term insensibility, the possibility that there might be someone who can't even enjoy pleasures, like an overly ascetic person. And this, he says, is very rare, and I think it's probably very rare today. Most of us, if we're going to struggle with anything, it's with overdoing pleasure. But perhaps there are people who just can't relax, or they feel guilty, or something that's causing them to not enjoy their lives. So once again, you can fall off the horse on either side, and it seems at least possible. Then there's a couple that we might be surprised that they're on the list. Ones like truthfulness and friendliness, where he's really dealing with, even truthfulness isn't about honesty generally, but it's more about how we talk about ourselves and that we tell the truth about ourselves. And friendliness is not about having friends, deep friends. It's about how we conduct ourselves when we're just running into people as we go throughout our day. And so we might think, well, these are kind of shallow, you know. Oh, he also has wittiness. Wittiness is an important virtue. Once again, it's sort of how you are in social situations. And so we might say these are a little shallow. You know, why put these on the list of virtues? I mean, someone who's shy I don't consider immoral. But if you go back to the notion that Aristotle's theory is morally comprehensive, meaning it includes all of life, because all of life is relevant to my happiness and my well-being. Even the fact that I brushed my teeth this morning is relevant to my well-being. So how relevant is it to our well-being that people are simply polite to one another in company, that I say, how are you doing, to the clerk at the grocery store, or that I give you a little wave in traffic, or that somebody holds the door for me, or that I smile at you when I pass in the hall? Well, let's just stop for a minute and imagine a world in which we didn't do those things. Think about how bad you've felt when you've had to deal with a stranger who's extremely grumpy or grouchy, maybe someone in a store that's supposed to be serving you, or someone who's just walking past you and, you know, brushing you and not acknowledging it, or something like that. It's actually very difficult to deal with that. And so if we can imagine what life would be like without it, then we can see why Aristotle includes it. And this goes right back to our being social beings. It's very important that we have a good environment to be in so that we can flourish. It's not just me, myself, and I and my personal efforts that's going to make me good. It's going to take the whole community. So something like that sort of politeness is extremely important. And so we also talked about wittiness, right, which is the ability to be entertaining at parties. The painfully shy person, even though we might pity that person, he actually would say, what you need to do is then make an action plan to get yourself in the mix at a party. You need to show up, you need to introduce yourself, and start figuring out how to communicate better. I actually have a friend who struggled with painful shyness, and he started taking dancing lessons. And I'm sure he was super uncomfortable, but he took several different kinds of dancing lessons and really came out of his shell, and is a really good public speaker now and very comfortable with himself. So it's interesting to see how you can change those things through doing, through actions, right? And in fact, the painfully shy person isn't happy. That's a very unhappy place to be when you feel that you can't even approach someone at a party and you don't know how to meet people, and you're overcome by anxiety. So even though those situations are sort of pitiable, that doesn't mean that they're not relevant to morality. And then, of course, you can be the buffoon who's swinging from the lampshades, right? And that's embarrassing for everyone involved. And so you don't want to fall off the horse on that side either. You want to be a person who's able to make witty conversation, keep the conversation going, be gracious when people make mistakes, and so forth. And then with regard to truthfulness, he's talking about telling the truth. Now, this is an interesting one because the Christians are possibly going to disagree. There's a lot that they agree on, and we're going to see that when we get to Thomas Aquinas. But on the other hand, humility is not necessarily a virtue for Aristotle. And why should it be? For Christians, every good thing comes from God. And so humility makes perfect sense because it's not due to me that I have good things. But for Aristotle, if you have a talent or something, then good for you. You did that. You developed that, and so you get the credit. So if someone says, hey, I heard you were a great piano player, then you say, oh, yes, I really enjoy it, and you don't deny it. If you deny it, that's false humility, and it's scraping and annoying when someone says, oh, no, I'm nothing. He doesn't like that. That's a kind of lying. And so it would be better to just say thank you very much. And then with regard to flattery is kind of the opposite end, or boasting, boasting is where you overplay your talents and you claim to have more than you really do. So that's what he's talking about there, and there's a few others, but you get the general idea. With regard to the very last one that he mentions is shame. And the reason I mention shame is because it's actually only a pseudo-virtue. And what I mean by pseudo-virtue is that once you're a virtuous person, you won't be doing anything to be ashamed of. So we wouldn't praise you for feeling shame. But if you're young, we expect you to make mistakes. And so if you were a young person who, for instance, cheated on an assignment, you might come into me and say, you know what, it was really wrong what I did. I'm ashamed of myself. That was lazy. It shows a poor character in me. I want to apologize. I'm going to do whatever I can to make up for it. There's a little part of me that's going to go, that's cool. I like that person. They took responsibility. So shame can be a praiseworthy thing in a young person who's learning. And then, of course, you can fall off the horse on the side of being shameless and not caring at all what you do. And we might say that our culture has an issue with that. And on the other end, you might be shameful and be taking responsibility for things that don't even involve you. And that also happens. I want to make a distinction here between the words shame and guilt. Guilt is more what Aristotle is actually talking about here. He's talking about feeling bad about something you've done, and he's using, it's translated shame because the words are sometimes used simultaneously, but, or synonymously, I should say. But shame, we might say, is actually something different in modern parlance. That's a kind of bad feeling about your whole self, a sense that you're unredeemable and useless. Aristotle would reject this altogether. There's no purpose for this sort of feeling. It's a feeling that only arises in people who've been damaged in some way through, for instance, childhood abuse. And it doesn't do any good because if you feel that way, you can't do anything about it, so you're just stuck. And it often leads to suicide and death. And so it's not a useful emotion. Because it's misdirected. Instead of feeling guilty about something I did so that I can change it, I'm feeling shame about who I am. Well, there's nothing I can do about that, so I'm stuck. So I just wanted to make that point there. Okay, let's move on to book 3.